Hey guys, I hope all is well. I got another build here for you today featuring Blade Shift. You might be wondering why anyone would center a build around a single target basic skill like this, and the answer is because I'm crazy. I wanted to challenge myself and see if I can make a build that performs well regardless of the skill, and I think I'm going to try and slowly do that for every skill in the game, no matter how basic it is, just to see if I can take it anywhere. So I'm pretty sure almost no one starts off with the skill as their primary basic skill because the current meta is heavily favored towards Puncture and Heartseeker. However, I don't like playing by the meta and I like to explore on my own and see what I can come up with. With that being said, I'm excited to share with you what I think became a decent build honestly with nearly 40k life, about 1700% increased vulnerable damage, and about 2000% increased damage with Victimize, all of which is certainly respectable as it slayed every single tormented boss and clipped the wings of Uber Lilith, that goddamn glorified rooster. And of course, it can even do tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons as well. Unfortunately, for the sake of running out of time, I've only showcased the high 80s in the pit, but I was honestly doing it quite comfortably, and I have no doubt I could have taken it to the 90s and even 100 and beyond. So this is crazy, right? How did I get so far with Blade Shift of all things? What even is this skill? Before I jump into the video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you think of the build because any feedback is always appreciated. So back to the question of how this build got so far. By itself, Blade Shift is a bit lackluster because it's basically a single target ability that grants movement speed, allows you to move through enemies, and can either daze or grant resistances plus decrease crowd control duration on you. It's a cool assassin ninja stealth concept, but it certainly won't carry you through the game on its own. So the build works because of two things: the AoE damage from Pain Gorger gauntlets and the AoE damage from the Victimized Keystone, both of which add something essential for Blade Shift to function smoothly, which is AoE damage. And I've tried doing it without the Pain Gorgers, but it just doesn't play as smoothly, although I do swap to a regular pair of gloves for bossing because the AoE from Pain Gorgers isn't necessary for high level bossing. Alright, so to activate Pain Gorger, you gotta deal non-basic damage to an enemy, and this is done by Caltrops, Poison Trap, and even Dash. So if I throw down my Caltrops or Poison Trap, whatever it did damage to can be Pain Gorged, and whatever I dash through can also be Pain Gorged. Then the mobs will have an icon above their heads to indicate that they're marked, and hitting them will cause the AoE damage, and that damage will echo to all marked enemies. So it's important to have a big Caltrop size because that will mark a lot more enemies, which will echo a lot more damage. However, the Pain Gorgers is just a supplemental source of area damage. The real source of area damage comes from Victimize and stacking as much vulnerable damage as comfortably possible to get those big fat juicy big boy explosions that do millions of damage. However, the problem with Victimize is that not only do I have to be hitting a vulnerable enemy, which requires a reliable way to make enemies vulnerable, but Victimize only has a 50% chance to activate, which makes it even more important that I have a reliable way to make enemies vulnerable, because if I can't even do that, then Victimize will be less and less useful. So you can easily solve this problem by just running the exploit glyph, which guarantees that enemies will be vulnerable on hit, but there's an inherent problem with the exploit glyph. First, it only makes the enemies vulnerable for 4 seconds, which is fine because most things I hit will die within those 4 seconds, but the problem comes with bossing, because the glyph states the same enemy can't be exploited twice within 20 seconds. So if I'm hitting a boss or an enemy with a lot of health, the first hit makes them vulnerable for 4 seconds, and after 4 seconds, exploit will not be able to make them vulnerable again for another 16 seconds, which is absolutely unacceptable because that means in those next 16 seconds, Victimize will never go off. And that's because the boss isn't vulnerable. So I've got two remedies for this problem. First, I've opted to get an affix on my gear that grants my lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable on hit to compensate for those 16 seconds of exploit downtime. Second, I've got an aspect of a cursed touch with 35% chance from a lucky hit to make enemies vulnerable. The good thing about Blade Shift is that it already has a high base lucky hit chance at 50%, so I highly suggest getting lucky hit chance on your gear wherever comfortably possible and using an elixir of advantage to boost your lucky hit chance. I suggest having at least 75 to 80% total lucky hit chance at the very least in order to comfortably play this build reliably and get those Victimized explosions going off pretty frequently. Other than that, to be blunt, this is no top tier Heartseeker build with Harlequins and maxed out Masterwork gear. Blade Shift is okay and decent at best, since it's a single target basic ability with no natural way to deal multi-target damage without getting it elsewhere. I did try to take it as far as I was willing to, and I'm sure it can be be definitely taken even further with more hours into the build and fully optimized gear. I'm pretty much showing you possibly the casual player's build with somewhat good gear with a fair amount of masterwork into it and decent affixes to help get the build going. If you want to try and look cool and fight like Ezio, running around stabbing enemies, throwing some grenades, traps, and smoke bombs here and there and going stealth like an assassin, then this build is for you. But I'm pretty sure there are other cooler looking ninja assassin builds out there that utilize core abilities which are far superior to basic abilities to some extent, and I'd suggest not trying to replicate this build because it's just very off meta. But regardless, I really wanted to showcase it anyways because I had a ton of fun making it. Alrighty, so let's move on to our gear aspects and jewels. For my helm, I've got Umbris to generate free Dark Shroud to give me crit chance, movement speed, and damage reduction. And I've also got life, armor, and lucky hit chance tempered with more life and chance to freeze. And I've embedded it with a ruby for increased max life. For my chest, I've got concussive strikes for extra DPS to dazed enemies, and I've got life, res, +4 to Dark Shroud to further boost the damage reduction, which is very important, and it's tempered with more life and chance to freeze. And I've embedded it with rubies for increased max life. For my general gloves, I've got the unique Pain Quarter's gauntlets, as I mentioned before, because it enhances basic skill damage and causes our non-basic damage to enable AoE damage by marking enemies. But for my bossing gloves, I've got Aspect of Elements, which gives a huge damage boost every 7 seconds, and it's also got life, vulnerable damage, and lucky hit chance tempered with more vulnerable damage and a chance to stun on hit. So the reason I run with the Pain Gorgers on non-bossing is because the procs from Victimize don't go off 100% of the time, so the AoE damage from Pain Gorgers will complement the downtime of those procs, and it'll make clearing packs much smoother and easier. For my legs, I've got Aspect of Might for further damage reduction, and I've got life, res, +5 to blade shift, which is very important because it's literally the entire build, and it's tempered with more res and chance to immobilize. I was going for a chance to freeze or stun, but I wasn't lucky enough with this one, and I haven't found a similar pair of legs since. I've also embedded it with a couple rubies for increased max life. For my boots, I've got Frostbite Aspect, which makes my grenade skills have a chance to freeze enemies, which helps stagger bosses much faster. It's also got life, movement speed, and res, and it's tempered with chance to freeze and blade shift movement speed, which is awesome because it's just so much extra movement speed, and it just feels like a huge quality of life improvement. For my amulet, I've got Adaptability Aspect, which more than doubles my blade shift damage, and I've got crit chance, lucky hit chance, and lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable, and I tempered it with vulnerable damage and dodge chance, and I've embedded it with a skull to help reach armor cap. For my first ring, I've got Trickster's Aspect, which causes my caltrops to drop stun grenades, which helps me survive and stagger bosses, and it's also got vulnerable damage, lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable, and some res because I couldn't find a better ring, and I tempered it with caltrop cooldown reduction and vulnerable damage, and I've embedded it with a diamond for all res. For my second ring, I've got Aspect of Accursed Touch, which, as I've mentioned before, makes enemies vulnerable, so it's very important, and it's also got dex, attack speed, and lucky hit chance, and I've tempered it with more vulnerable damage and agility cooldown reduction, and I've embedded it with an amethyst for shadow res. For my two-handed, I'm using a crossbow, and it's got Moonrise, which is huge because it gives me a massive boost in attack speed, multiplicative basic damage, and movement speed, which pretty much makes this aspect seem like a staple for basic builds, honestly. It's got dex, life, and vulnerable damage, and I tempered it with more vulnerable damage and caltrop duration because increased caltrop duration increases the damage mobs take while in my caltrops, and it's a very significant source of increased damage. And I've embedded it with sapphires for increased vulnerable damage. For my main hand, I'm using a dagger for damage to close enemies with retribution aspect for increased damage to stun and knock down enemies, and it's got life, damage, and vulnerable damage, and I've tempered it with more vulnerable damage and increased caltrop size for quality of life. And I've embedded it with a sapphire for more vulnerable damage. And lastly, for my offhands, I'm using another dagger for damage to close enemies with Edgemaster's aspect. Since we're pretty much always at max energy, it's just free damage and hard to pass up. It's also got life, damage, and vulnerable damage, and I've tempered it with more vulnerable damage and more increased caltrop size for more quality of life. And lastly, I've embedded it with a sapphire for more vulnerable damage. I'm honestly getting very tired of saying vulnerable damage, but this entire build is vulnerable damage. Alrighty, so for my skill tree, of course the whole build is centered around blade shift, so try to get as many points of that as you can. I have 10, and then I do go into primary blade shift instead of fundamental because I don't think this is very useful and it's kind of hard to activate because you have to move through enemies 5 times, so I just stuck with primary. And then I come here and get Sturdy and Siphoning Strikes. This is why we build Crit Chance, so that we can have somewhat of a reliable heal in our build. And then of course Caltrops into Discipline Caltrops for more Crit Chance. And then I get Rugged for damage reduction from damage over time. Weapon Mastery is a staple. And then I get Concussive for increased crit chance, and then Trick Attacks for more stagger building. And then of course I got Dash for mobility. And over here you want to get as much points into Dark Shroud as possible because this is a really great source of damage reduction. And then I get Countering Dark Shroud for more crit chance. And then Concealment is really nice for getting out of sticky situations and also sneaking into a pack of enemies without setting off their affixes. And then I get Smoke Grenade for the dazing, and then the Countering for cooldown reduction, and then Poison Trap, which helps activate my Pain Gorgers, and then Enhanced Poison Traps for the knockdown and stagger building. And then I do get Agile, which is really nice for boosting my dodge chance, and I think overall I have about 30% from using cooldowns and then activating Agile. And then of course you want Exploit and Malice, which is pretty staple. And then over here I get Frigid Finesse because of our chances to freeze on our gear, so that also gives us a nice damage boost. And then over here, I get Trap Mastery for extra crit chance, and then Adrenaline Rush into Haste for that juicy movement speed. And then obviously we have our Victimize with about 2000% increased damage. And then for our Paragon board, our starter board, we have Chip, which helps with the damage boost to physical damage, which is really nice. And then next we go Exploit Weakness for all that vulnerable damage. And then we socket Fluidity for increased times damage, which is really nice. And then it also boosts the magic nodes here, which is really nice for the stats. And then I kind of branch off into 2 boards here. Over here, I have No Witnesses, and I socket Pride, which boosts damage and stats here, and then which boosts maximum life here, which is really nice. And then Pride itself gives a nice boost to physical damage. And on our 4th board, we have Cheap Shot, which is some lovely damage to crowd-controlled enemies. And then, of course, we have Control for even more damage to crowd-controlled enemies, and especially to stun and frozen enemies. And then on our 5th board, we have Deadly Ambush, but we don't need any crit damage in our build because Victimize doesn't benefit at all from crit damage. So we only really come here for Spring Loaded to help with trap cooldown reduction, and we socket Exploit, of course, to make enemies vulnerable. And on our 6th board, we have Tricks of the Trade, which we don't need because we only just come here to socket Devious, which helps boost the stats here, which is really nice for activating the sub bonuses of the rest of our Paragon stuff. And also this does give damage to elites, and it does help me reach armor cap. And lastly, for our 7th board, since we had some extra points, I just came into Cunning Stratagem, just so I can come here and get some basic damage and some general percent damage. Alrighty, so before I show you the Uber Lilith fight, I just want to say that this is literally the hardest boss of any game I've ever played, and I've played all the Dark Souls games, and those are way easier than this stupid boss. And the fight is completely unfair at times because you can literally glitch her and she'll become invincible in phase 1 and will refuse to die. Also, sometimes during phase 2, the blood boils spawn projectiles at an accelerated rate and don't stop spawning projectiles, which literally makes the fight impossible and unplayable. And last but not frustratingly the least, one time in phase 2, she literally broke the last platform on the left and then proceeded to light the entire arena on fire, which is impossible to survive and is guaranteed death. I hope that none of this is intended, because if so, that is absolutely unacceptable for a video game boss. And if these are glitches, I hope that this is brought to Blizzard's attention, and I hope they fix it. So without further ado, here is the real Lilith fight, and I'll admit that I cried after I killed her. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the fight, and I will see you guys next time.